Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to look at the war in the Vendee. So what is the war in the Vendee and what is the Vendee? The Vendee is this, I'll put a picture up here of the map. It's on the western coast of France. It's in between La Rochelle and Nantes. I think it's say. No French, so it'll all be mispronounced. It's this wooded bocage countryside of it's basically inaccessible even today. I think you have to fly in or get a boat or a train or something. Like, it's not somewhere you just sort of end up and drive all around the Vendee. It's still very rugged and rural, so it's a very rural area. And what's this whole war in the Vendee? Who would want to invade this place full of peasants and trees and bocage? Well, it was the French Republicans of the First Republic, of the revolutionaries. So let's have a look at why the war in the Vendee happened. So the French Revolution starts in 1789. I won't go into all the nonsense surrounding the French Revolution. We're only going to focus on the two parts of it that matter to the war in the Vendee, which is the suppression of the Catholic Church and the execution of King Louis of France. So the church property was seized a year after the revolution in 1790. This is why the government is actually the ones refurbishing Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, because the state technically owns it, because it just came in with a bunch of guns and took all of the church property, which was about 10% of the land in France. France was still very feudalistic. The king, this is why people, on one hand, it's bad because it's feudalistic, but on the other hand, it's bad because the king has all this power. But they can't both be true, because a feudal society is a devolved society. So France was still very much run, and we'll see this later, very, very much run locally in the different, I can't remember what they call them, districts or whatever they're called. The different states is what we Anglo people would call them, although I'm not actually, anyway. In Australia, we'd call them states. Canada, they call them provinces, that sort of thing. To the point where they had these hundreds of years old laws in these provinces, which we'll talk about later. And so the king doesn't actually have a lot of power. One of the things that King Louis was doing to make normal people's lives a little bit better was actually initiating a reform where he would get some of that power and lift it up to his level, so he could actually control things. Like at one point, the taxes exist in some areas but not in others, which just creates a bunch of crime as people smuggle things from the non-tax area into the tax area, and it creates a bunch of unnecessary crime. But the people getting the money from the taxes, that area, they don't particularly care. It doesn't matter if, Anyway, it's too much to go into right now. So the church property is seized, and the seizure of the church property is then used to create this new money, which we'll talk about later, but I'll mention now. It's created on the back of as collateral was this church property. And the civil constitution of the clergy was put forward. And in the civil constitution of the clergy, you basically couldn't sign it if you were a member of the clergy. You couldn't sign it. It was basically the French government is supreme, and I'm going to do what they say. It included the election of local parish priests by anyone in the community. So the local government could get the Jewish community to elect someone to be the parish priest, and whoever they elected was the parish priest. And as far as I know, it didn't matter if they were actually Catholic. Or you could have the Protestant community do the same thing. Which is basically, that's not how any of it works. First of all, you don't elect your parish priest, you never have. Or at least, I shouldn't say never have. Not in the last 1,000, 1,500 years, you haven't. Bishops are different, but that's its own thing. So you couldn't sign this. You placed yourself under the French government, not under the Pope. The Pope was writing all these encyclicals and letters denouncing this constitution of the clergy and the seizure of all the land without paying for it. So essentially, the church was suppressed. 75% of the priests refused to sign it, straight up. Most bishops refused to sign it, almost all of them. So if you didn't sign it, that was a death sentence. So these priests went into hiding. Although not, of course, you can't kill that many people. Even you get into World War II territory with the Nazis, even they couldn't get everyone who didn't agree with them, which is why you still had people hiding out long after the war, up until the end of the war, people were still hiding. And even, you can't even get all the public people because you don't even know that they're not signing the Constitution. I mean, what are you going to go and check? You've got, invasions from these other countries happening. So the civil constitution of the clergy, essentially, the government took over the church, which never ends well. They shut down the monasteries and the convents, which was a shame because the English had done this earlier, and a lot of English monasteries and convents had come over to France. And a lot of English clergy were being trained in France because it could be trained back home. And so this kind of had a knock-on effect of affecting the English Catholic Church as well. But anyway, they banned the religious from wearing habits, which is this is a Carmelite nun. That'll be relevant later. And they couldn't even live together. Why you would do that to a bunch of contemplative nuns? They're not a political force. They literally just sit inside and pray, and maybe they have a farm where they do farming stuff. They're not giant powerhouses politically. You could probably just take everything from them that they produced on this farm if you're worried about them making money. They shut them down because they hated the church, which we'll get into later. And basically no one in the Vendee swore this oath, because if you swore it in the Vendee, they'd probably kill you. People who did swear it were killed, let's put it that way. So the first of the three big gut punches that starts the war in the Vendee is the assault on the Catholic Church. So the first big gut punch is the assault on the Catholic Church. But let's look a little bit at the Vendee, try to understand the people who live there, to understand why that's a big impact. Catholicism was the mainstream religion of all France, almost all France. There was Huguenots and all this other sort of stuff, but the overwhelming majority of France was Catholic, and the overwhelming majority of France didn't rise up. So the Vendee is extremely poor. It's not the best place to grow things. The nobility of the Vendee were even so poor that they couldn't live in Versailles. So the classic thing of the French Revolution, the preamble to it, is the whole, the nobility just live in Versailles. And everyone anybody who's got all this money just goes to Versailles and hangs out with the king all day and all this sort of thing. But the nobility of the Vendee couldn't afford to do that because where would they get their money from? Their estates were basically worthless. They were just enough to keep them. Maybe once or twice a year they'd go to Versailles on a special occasion or something like that, which we'll get into later. There's a lot of build-up to one story that I want to tell later, so excuse me. The nobility were very local, and because they were local, you had to be liked. Because what are you going to do, hang around with people who hate you all day? And the nobility in the Vendee were very much not as aloof as the nobility in other places. You can understand somebody who's like a nobleman of Normandy, or of I don't know, there's a Duke of Normandy, whatever. He's probably got a lot of cash coming in. There's ports up there and that sort of stuff, so he can afford to just never see his people. But if you're running a chateau and half the people in the town work for you in some capacity or another, or someone in their family, or one of their cousins does, comes in and trims a hedge or something like that, you sort of become more of a local figure to the community. The women of the Vendee were actually one of the major reasons for the pushback. The women of the Vendee were very devout, which becomes a problem later. We'll see about that. They refused to use the French money, so they refused to sell anything, because the French money was what was it called? It was called the French money was called the assignat, 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 we'll call it, which was basically the money they created based on the collateral of all the church property that they seized. So the women of the Vendee basically went, well, we're not going to use that, because it's stolen church property. We're not going to validate it. They also refused to even associate with any priest who signed the civil constitution of the clergy, which is fairly standard. And the French women essentially, they really cared about their families, because what else are you going to do? You live in a very poor area, very rural area, an area where you might have 2 or 3 generations living in the same house or within visual distance of one another for your entire life. Family was a very strong unit. And the third gut punch will be the thing that springs this all off. And I know I'm sort of jigsawing this whole thing and taking at the middle, but it's all important later. So the French women of the Vendee had a deep sense of religion and of family. One of the things, incidentally, which really pissed off a lot of these people and really annoyed people all over France was that the church was not allowed to run schools anymore. But the government didn't run them either. Like, the church provided the schools because obviously you had brothers and priests who were educated and that sort of thing, and they can run schools. The government just went, okay, well, you pay 10% of your income to the church if you live on church land. Which is this, like, imagine if you only had to pay 10% of your income in taxes, how phenomenal that would be to us who pay insane amounts of money in taxes. Anyway, compared to 10%. And then they basically just shut the school down and didn't open it again. And so a lot of these women were like, well, my child was being educated, no matter how poorly, by this hungover priest who was just showing up and scribbling things on the board. But they were being educated in some way. And now they're not. And the state basically, not all the schools, but the majority of them were just shut down. Inflation reached about 3,500%, which is we're going through a bit of an inflation cycle now. We can see how hard it is when it goes up only 1 or 2 or 3 or 4% or whatever it is now. I think they change the way they calculate it, so you can never tell what it is. But anyway, imagine 3,000% inflation on this government money. But luckily for the people in the Vendee, they weren't using the government money, so it didn't matter. One of the problems they had with the government money, slight tangent, was that they were trying to get more money by selling property. But the thing is, the property they were selling was just confiscated. And people didn't want to buy confiscated property because you could just confiscate it again. Like, imagine if I just stole something from you and then turned to somebody else and be like, hey, would you like to buy this? You'd be like, no, you just stole it. You'll just steal it back from me again. It's so the money was basically worthless. This French money was trash. I'm going to mention him now because it. I've laid a few threads, and let's put some of them in a little ball right now. There's a semi-mythical figure. He's a real person, and he did real things. But there's one part of the story that some people say definitely happened, and some people say definitely didn't happen. I happen to be in the camp that it's probably true. Called Jean Chouan Cottereau was his real name, but Chouan basically was a name he would use with his bushwhacking guerrilla force. But anyway, he was a smuggler. This is sort of in the 1789, 1790 period. He's a smuggler. So what did he smuggle? Did he smuggle opium? Opium was a big thing to smuggle back. No, that was the British government smuggling opium. Cocaine? No, the CIA wasn't founded yet. Was it? Well, it wasn't drugs, so maybe it was guns. Was he smuggling guns? No. Swords, weapons, knives? No. Counterfeit currencies? No. Was it? Oh hell! What illegal thing was he smuggling? Well, he wasn't actually smuggling anything illegal. Okay, well then probably wasn't much of a high risk smuggler. Although what he smuggled would get you the death penalty if you smuggled it while armed, which you had to because people would try and rob you while you were smuggling things because you're a criminal. He smuggled salt. He was a salt smuggler. His whole family was salt smugglers, and salt smuggling was incredibly common in the Vendee, to the point where all the salt smugglers basically joined his unit in this guerrilla war against the Republican forces when they came into the Vendee. He was a salt smuggler. Salt was worth, let's say, 10 money. Like a unit of salt was worth 10 silly-sounding French money. I can't pronounce it. Like sou, something like that, with the real money, not the fake Republican money. And I say Republican, it's not a jab at any modern day political stuff. The French Republican government, that sort of thing. So 1 unit of salt was worth 10 here, and then across the river it was worth 1. So I will buy it at 1, or maybe even at 2 because I'm dodgy, and sell it at 4 or 6. And so I will make money moving salt across a river or through a back road or something like that. And this worked until he beat a customs officer to death with a weapon. Although he didn't actually do it, he assaulted the guy, and then the guy he was with killed the customs officer, beat him to death with a club, which is pretty nasty. In our law, in sort of Western not Western, but Anglo law, that's murder. That's felony murder. You committed a murder while you're doing a felony. Even if he never hit the guy, a guy died while you were doing a felony, you're going to jail. And he was going to be executed. This is the part of the story that if you believe the people who think history is boring crowd who can't believe anything ever important happens, what happened was he just kind of got out of it somehow by joining up to the military for some reason, which he then deserted from, and then was caught and went to prison for 2 years where he found Jesus. And then because he found Jesus, he fought against the Republicans. That's the theory of the people who just want to suck the life out of everything and never let you have any fun with history. Because the story I'm about to tell is the story I think is true, and that is an accepted version, but there's two sort of sides. So that's the first one, that he kind of just a bunch of people didn't want to testify against him anymore. The prosecutor just bungled the case for no reason, and then he just deserts from the military and still isn't put to death, despite being a career lifelong criminal. Anyway, what I think happened, and what is an accepted mainstream story, is that he is about to be executed. Think happened, and it's the other version of the story, is that he is about to be executed. His mother, who loves her son, because again, women of the Vendee love their family, goes to the coach driver of the local noble, Prince Talmont. I'll put his name up here. But he is just left for Versailles. This was the one time of the year when the local nobility went to Versailles. So she walks to Versailles, sort of stopping along the way to beg for food and sleeping on the side of the road and in people's barns, which is it's a perfectly reasonable distance to walk in a number of days. Like, it's not like she ran there overnight. And she gets to Versailles, but obviously they won't let her in because she's a disgusting peasant woman without any shoes. And you can't come into the king's palace looking like that. So she goes to she finds, after wandering around Versailles, sort of trying to get in, she finds the coach driver of the local prince. And he says, okay, well, I can get you in. If you sit in the back of the coach, we'll draw the little curtains, and we can get you through the guards. But what happens once you're in there, it's not my problem. So she gets in through the gate, and she basically gets out of the coach, and either the king is there nearby or she goes to him and basically runs up to him and says, there's actually the words, there's different versions of the same words, but it's basically like, Monsignor, my son is about to be executed, you have to save him. And the king is basically just struck by this peasant woman calling him Monsignor, which is basically like my lord or something like that. Like, it's not how you're supposed to address a king, but he's just, this humble peasant woman has come to him, in his palace, to his face, saying, please save my son. And he writes immediately a stay of execution and gives it to the woman, and then goes and does the proper pardon and sends the stay of execution with some soldiers to the thing, and the guy gets freed. So that's probably how he got out of the beating to death a customs officer, was with a royal pardon. Now, he still had to pay for that. Like, you can't just beat a man to death and not go to, get any punishment. So he spent a little bit of time in prison. And then what is then proposed is that the local nobleman who smuggled his mother into Versailles got him into the military as another punishment of, like, look, you got to spend some time in the military to get out of this area. You got to let things calm down. These customs people, you've really annoyed them. They're going to be coming for you, so let's get you out of this place. And then he deserts from the army after a certain amount of time, which he then gets put into jail after that, and then is released after a few years. I think that's a more plausible story, even with the whole person smuggling themselves into the king's thing at Versailles. I think that's a more plausible story, because the other version of the story relies on a bunch of people just not even being threatened to not testify. They just kind of don't want to. The prosecutor bungling the case for some reason. Yeah, I like the second version. One of the good things about the second version too is it actually explains why this smuggler, who would actually serve to make some money off this revolution if he wanted to, was so committed to fighting against this thing, to the point where he would die fighting against it. We'll get to that later. But Jean, Jean Catereau, I can't pronounce French, is said to have famously said, when this all kicks off and the Vendee does the boogaloo, he famously says, "I owe my life for my king." And so he would spend the rest of his life avenging the king that had just been executed. So I just mentioned the second big punch in the guts is that in January of 1793, King Louis is executed along with members of his family. There's a whole big boring political story. Well, it's actually interesting, but the story of the whole the terror and all this sort of thing going on in the background, the mass executions, Robespierre going insane, and not going insane, but Robespierre getting dealt with and all this sort of thing. And there's this new election where they elect a bunch of radicals who are more radical than the radicals that are already pretty radical who are elected, which all is really unimportant to this. But the king is executed. And the people of the Vendee are royalists, as most normal people were at this time. Most people in Europe were monarchists of some kind. Even in Britain, where you've got a parliament, you still got the king. And so it's this random people who have just shut all the churches down, executed a bunch of priests, shut down all the convents, and now have forced you to have mass in your living room around some wooden table, or, push a table up against the wall and have mass or something like that. They've now killed your king, who was, in your eyes, the only thing that was stopping them from going fully extreme. And then they went fully extreme. It's almost like there was one thing stopping them, and it's like the brick that you take out and the whole wall comes down. Because straight after they kill the king, there's a bunch of wars, and the Republicans say, well, we need soldiers. And how do you get soldiers? You conscript them. And so they pass an act basically saying, we're going to send around guys, and every family's got to send someone to fight for the French Republic, Vive la France, all that nonsense. And I'll let Charles Cologne fill you in on what happened next.
Well, now let's see. You put our priests into hiding. You have killed our king. And now you think you're going to come here and take our sons? No, you're not. And that was the beginning of the rising in the Vendee.
Charles Cologne is a historian. I'll mention some of his stuff later. He's quite a good historian, and he's a French Canadian, so he's got an interest in this French area. The final straw is when the government comes to take your children to make them fight and die for a war to defend the government that you despise. You can see why the French women did not like this. You can see why the French men would not want to go along with this. And it initially starts with a bunch of riots. It's not the theme of the Vendee uprising is it's so decentralized, which becomes a problem. But it's spontaneous. It's literally just a bunch of people rioting. The leader of the French riots. Well, anyway, we'll get to that. Essentially, basically, there's a bunch of small riots, which then turn into bigger riots, which become mobs, which become roving mobs that rove around killing a bunch of people who are Republicans, and then some Republicans do some revenge killings, so they take a town and massacre people, massacre hundreds of Republicans in this town. And eventually it just becomes enough rioting people look at one another and they go, okay, let's, some charismatic figures rise to the top, as the cream does. Cream always goes to the top. And they basically get into these hodgepodge units armed with pitchforks and a few muskets, but mostly non-firearms, mostly just tools and weapons. And they go, well, we're already here. The government forces haven't come yet. So they basically start attacking towns. There's a very famous story, and I know it's real because nobody disputes that it's real, but nobody can agree on who it actually was about. So an angry mob with the torches and pitchforks and all that sort of thing gathers outside the chateau of a local nobleman, and the nobleman's inside going, okay, great. I've heard of this happening before. Am I going to get guillotined, or are they going to shoot me? It's the French Revolution, and an angry mob has come to a nobleman's house. And they were furious. They were really angry. And what they were angry about was that he had not led them. That he was He was sitting there, and they needed somebody to lead them, and you're the local leader, so you should lead us. And he comes out and he basically is struck, and he says, look, we can't win. We can't take on the government with, we're not Vietnamese, we're just French. We can't take on the government, we're just farmers, and they basically say, look, we got to do something. And then he agrees to lead them. But is that Bonchamp? Is that a bunch of other guys? Who knows? But it's a nobleman had this happen at some point, and I can believe it. That being said, there's this myth too that these counter-revolutionary, these royalist movements were led by the nobility who were trying to claw back power. And a lot of the nobility were just trying to, if you didn't fight, you'd be killed. So, you have every incentive to fight for the counter-revolutionaries. But the war in the Vendee was actually led by a merchant, by just some simple merchant peddler who was also probably a smuggler, because it's easy money, called Catilinot. Catilinot basically gets involved in the riots at the beginning. Him and 30 guys from the local village decide they're going to kick off, burn a bunch of stuff, throw things, break stuff. Eventually, he is such an inspiring figure. He's very charismatic because, he's a merchant. He makes his money by talking. Most merchants are all selling the same thing, but if you can talk better than everybody else, you make cash. And he wasn't fantastically rich because he was a merchant in an area where nobody had money, which, doesn't make you fantastically wealthy. So Catilinot eventually gets a bit of momentum going, and Catilinot basically takes over a minor French town, which had a garrison of soldiers. And this was a pretty big victory. They took this town, and it was like, okay, well, we've just rebelled against the government, and now we've taken over a town. What are we going to do now? Well, we'll go home for Easter, because it was Easter. So the army basically just disintegrated and went home. And this was a problem the Vendee had a lot, in that an army of peasants is very hard to keep on the field. And this happens all the time throughout all of history. The Americans deal with this in their own boogaloo they had some years before the revolution. Is that an army of peasants is hard to keep in the field, because an army of peasants are the people who feed the people in the field. So they need to be at home with the crops. Also, their families don't have a lot of money. So, and you're not paying them to just be rioting and, kicking off in the Vendee. So they've got to get cash somehow. So basically it's tricky for them to keep these armies together, but it becomes easier as stuff goes on. Anyway, let's take a step through the war in the Vendee, step by step. So in the open country, in the area with the big towns like Nantes and Tours and these other French words I can't pronounce, these riots were basically suppressed the way you would expect, with bloodshed and guns and all this sort of thing, because French Republic. But in the Bocage country, you can't suppress riots in the Bocage country, because you march down the street with your little soldiers with their funny hats and their silly things, and then people throw rocks at you from the Bocage, and then when you go to chase them, they're faster than you, they know the country, they get away, and you're stuck there, all this sort of stuff. You can't deal with that area with just normal troops. Normal numbers of troops. So the first big massacre that I talked about was at Machelico. I don't know, I can't speak French. Whose mayor was super pro-Republic and all this stuff, and had been causing problems for the people in the Vendee for a long, long time. And so they surrounded the town, this giant angry mob of peasants, and just did to him what he wanted done to them. They executed him and a bunch of other pro-Republican people. Basically, the other side started massacring people, especially priests, and they found priests, they killed them. A lot of the Vendee War, the priests didn't lead it, which if I end up talking about the Cristeros is a different thing. The priests were very useful in the Vendee in that they could read, and they could communicate with one another, because they all had the common language of Latin, or at least a rudimentary knowledge of Latin. Whereas France was all using different dialects and all this sort of stuff. So the priests were useful in that you could communicate, and they could write, and they could inspire people and all that sort of thing. But as for military leadership, that was sort of not really their style, as you can imagine. In May, Louise Lescure marches on Thouars. There, it's got its name here. There's a picture. There's this bridge that they get held up at for a few hours, and then he basically just he becomes famous doing this. He just charges across the bridge. And then these men see that he charges across and there's all this gunfire coming in. They don't kill him. So they surge across. And while everybody's watching this crazy lunatic run across this bridge with his army behind him, a French nobleman named Bonchamp comes with a big cavalry force of basically what's thought to be royalist cavalry who defected from the military, and basically hits this Republican army in the back and just folds it in half, basically, and forces it to retreat. So they go back into the town of Thouars. There's a few thousand of them. And then a Frenchman, who is very famous and very important in this, and whose name I will butcher, Henry de la Rochejaquelin. Basically turns up, takes control of these other two guys. This happens a lot. Whoever's in charge is basically the most charismatic person around you, and so you just gravitate towards them. And he makes a very interesting deal, which is you leave your guns here because I want them, and I'm going to have them. And we're going to take some of that money too. But you can all leave, because obviously the people in the Vendee don't have any prisons to put these people in. And they're not going to massacre thousands of people, because if you try and massacre them, they won't surrender. So they say, you have to leave and just swear an oath never to come back to the Vendee and fight against us. And you're like, well, I mean, how are you going to know? Well, what they did was they took these soldiers, who probably would have had hair like mine, because that was the style, probably even longer, and shaved their heads. And so the men in the Vendee ever found a soldier with a shaved head, which was not the standard dress, they knew it was one of these guys that they had let go, and they would kill them for breaking their vow. And this became a pretty common thing that they would do throughout the rest of the war in the Vendee. Take prisoners, let them go on the condition they don't come back. If they see guys with shaved heads, kill them. It's actually kind of a genius way of doing it. Although you better hope you didn't have, baldness when you got, put into the French military. Later in May, so that was sort of early May, in late May, Lescaut once again charged straight forward, screaming, "Vive le roi! Vive le roi!" which down here, which means "Long live the king!" Just screaming that while he charged forward. And all these people shooting at him, and he just ran through unscathed, which became his sort of thing that he did, was to charge forward screaming "Long live the king" while being shot at. La Rochejaquelin, a picture here, you'll see Vendéens dressed in two distinct ways. One of them is with these three, they're called three handkerchiefs or something like that. Normally it's the neck, the hat, and the waist. And that comes from the Rochejaquelin, who basically wore this as a personal thing. It's often shown as white, sometimes red, but mostly white. And this was like a personal thing the leaders did, to basically stand out, so the men would always know where they were, and the enemy would always know who to shoot at. Which is, because 18th century, because noblemen, this is standard practice at the time, to stand out as an officer, so it's modern people might see it as quite weird, but back then it would have been, oh, yes, there's my leader is there next to the big flag wearing the interesting uniform with the giant hat with the feather or whatever. So it's, it's fairly standard practice at the time. After the battle at Fontenay, basically most of the leaders adopted this style. The symbol of the Vendee rebels is this symbol. It's a heart with a cross on top of it. Now, I've read two very weird interpretations of what this. It's got a meaning which I'll tell you. It's a very solid meaning that nobody disputes except these weird people who apparently didn't do reading. Two people who both also don't believe the Jean Chouan story about the king's pardon and all that. So I read one person say that this was the authority of the church over the hearts of all men, which isn't what that means. And the second one was basically the love that people have for the king is second only to the love they have for Christ, because the heart is below the cross. That's not what that is. I don't even know how you make that up. This is the Sacred Heart of Jesus, which, anyway, it becomes a super, super famous, powerful, most important symbol in all Europe, which is why I'm baffled that these people didn't recognize it. The Sacred Heart becomes the main symbol until Divine Mercy. Divine Mercy sort of becomes the new thing in era of St. John Paul II, which is why a lot of Catholic trads today are not big fans of Divine Mercy, because it overtook the Sacred Heart, which was the big trad thing of the... Anyway. But it's the Sacred Heart. And the French monarchy had always sort of been a bit standoffish with the Sacred Heart, but King Louis, the one who was executed, ended up... anyway, it's a long story, but this is the Sacred Heart. And the fact that the Catholic and Royal Army of the Vendee, as it was now being called, chose this as its symbol, shows that it was not just another royalist movement led by nobility. It's not just another peasant mob who's unhappy about conscription. They chose for their symbol the heart of Christ as their symbol. Anyway. In June, Catalano captures the town of Saumur, which is stashed with 50 cannons and enough muskets to arm an army. Think of the size of force that would carry with it 50 cannons. That's how many muskets he found in this town, which was sort of defended by a few thousand Frenchmen, French soldiers. Catalano basically found muskets, ammunition, ball, powder, everything you need, uniforms, which they didn't bother. There was no uniform of the Vendee, it was just peasant clothes. They basically were fully armed with modern military weapons by storming what amounted to be an arsenal town. Later on in June, they marched on Nantes, which is Nantes, which is apparently pronounced Nantes, according to the Google Translate voice button. 40,000 Vendéens versus 10,000 French Republicans. The French Republicans were sort of fortified in this town, and Catalano came in with these hodgepodge of different peasant groups, which he then armed with muskets. They had some cannon, and they marched on the town of Nantes. The problem was, and this is a problem with the Vendée, is that it's held together by these charismatic leaders, which I know the big men of history people are going to be all up in arms about. They're the people who think that, no one's really important because, even though, you gave that order, somebody had to, write down your thing and somebody bought you a cup of coffee. So, you don't get all the credit because, somebody went and handed that order to somebody else who handed it to somebody else. And so you're not the only one. It's a silly thing. Anyway, that's a tangent. I really don't like that. Some people were very important and famous and good, and without them, history would change. So don't pretend they weren't. It's a silly. Anyway, that's a tangent for a video. Essentially, there's these charismatic leaders that hold the whole army together, and the biggest one is Catalano, who is Generalissimo, or General whatever, the biggest general person. He's that. So he's commanding these noblemen. Even this merchant is commanding these noblemen, because that's just how it went down. And Catalano storms the gates of what's the name of the town again? I just said it a second ago. Anyway, so Catalano storms the gates of Nantes at the head of this army, and he gets shot. Everyone seems to say it was done by a sniper, or a sniper shot him. But I mean, as far as I know, the snipers don't become a thing until the First World War. They were marksmen and that sort of thing, but it was probably just a guy in a window who just was a good shot. So he gets killed, and as soon as he gets killed, everybody around him immediately grabs his body and drags him away. He's shot in the head, so he dies instantly. And then they look to their own leaders, and it's like, well, my leader is the Duc de Montcalm, who was not a real person. But, my leader is Bonchamp, or my leader is Lesieux. I'm not going to do what Bonchamp says. I'm not going to do what Lesieux says. And the army basically fragments and is forced to retreat because it lost its leadership. Because a militia force is really, really dependent on its leadership, which is why it's so effective to take that leadership out. This is sharp practice as an interesting mechanic with this, by the way, where you've got militia troops who they lose their leader. It's really bad for them. Big tangent, but I had to get some wargaming in there somewhere. The Vendéens would then fight two big field battles. So before this, it had been a lot of taking towns and defending towns and that sort of thing. But in June, a little bit after June would be July. In June, they fought the Battle of First Châtillon. Spoiler alert, there will be a second. And Vihiers. At First Châtillon, they inflicted massive casualties and killed the Republican general. Chambon, who Chambon had been the one defending some of these major towns. He was at Nantes. I'm pretty sure he was at Nantes. He may have been at Nantes. I'm almost certain he was at Nantes. And Chambon was basically this thorn in the side, this local commander. So his death was a big, not only as a revenge for Catalino, it's also, a nice thumb in the eye to the Republican forces. The Battle of Lucan was this running... It's not really a battle. It's called the Battle of Lucan. Even Wikipedia calls it that. I don't know why anyone would ever use Wikipedia as a source. Reading through it, skimming through it after I had written the script, just to check back on some stuff. I'm like, this thing is just out of control. The Wikipedia for the Vendee is terrible. Don't use it. The Battle of Lucan is basically this 4-week-long skirmish that goes back and forth, which essentially the Republicans win, but it's kind of just because attrition warfare doesn't really suit a militia force who keeps going home and coming back and shrinking in size and all that sort of stuff. And without dedicated supplies. Also, a lot of women and children were following these armies around because the Republicans were massacring people. And you couldn't stay at home without a man there to protect you because they would assume the man is out fighting in the Vendee with the Catholic and Royal Army, which they probably were. And they would just kill you and torch your house. It's very, very much the same. Well, not very much the same style, but it's a similar style of American South, loyalist v patriot. We've got, it's more about burning other people's houses down and getting back on scores and settling things than it is, patriotism. But in the Vendee, it was much more about patriotism. But that same sort of squabble. September was basically more skirmishing and stuff like that. The Vendeans, the Catholic and Royal Army, basically melted into the trees after they sort of had these 2 big successes in these big pitched battles, but more forces were coming in. Ironically, a lot of conscripts were being diverted to the Vendee to put down this rebellion, which kind of defeats the purpose of raising conscripts in the first place if you have to send them to put down a rebellion that starts because you raise conscripts. Anyway, we'll get into that later with the whole peace stuff. So the Vendeans just melt into the trees. At one point, they ambush a division and punch the crap out of it. And why the French let that happen, I don't know. Why they marched a full division into the Vendee is beyond me. In October, sort of early October, Second Chatillon, Second Battle of Chatillon, which is a Vendee defeat. After the skirmishing of September, they come back as a major army. They've just crushed this, well, not crushed, but they've just messed up this division, and they get their confidence back. They form an army again, and they get beaten. At Tremblay, I can't pronounce these. French need to have this. They need to get some pronounceable words. Lescaut is wounded. He's the guy who likes to charge out, screaming "Vive le roi," and he did that one too many times and got himself shot. He's still alive, but he got wounded, and his army sort of retreated with him. That was another problem. Is you're really built around this charismatic figure. If they go down, your army kind of waits for them to get back up again. So it's sort of paralyzed a bit. In October, as I said, the forces really start pouring in, and the orders come in to destroy the Vendee, to basically burn houses, clear out villages, towns, and that sort of thing. Now, a lot of these orders weren't followed because it was just impractical. And, it's the classic thing of Afghanistan. The problem that everybody has whenever they go into any country is that, for every house you burn, you just create more enemy soldiers. But a lot of, especially rural areas, they just destroy. But the big towns, they kind of left alone. At Cholet, October 17, the Vendeans got smashed really badly to the point where the army got split in half, which, as every DM will tell you, don't split the party. So the Vendeans split the party. Rochelle Jacqueline went to Granville because he thought a British fleet would be there. He took his part of the army up to Granville, where the British were supposed to be landing these French expats. These royalist French troops who had been evacuated to Britain were now, obviously it's kicked off in the Vendee, let's land there. Only that they didn't come. And the town of Granville was actually held by Republican forces. And they tried to take the town, really didn't have the manpower, and ended up getting thrown back. And then after that, the big showdown at Savagnier was just another Vendean defeat. The Catholic and Royal Army was really smashed there, and it ceased to exist as a field force. It just went back to the bocage and shooting from behind trees and that sort of thing. Now, Jean Chouan, that I mentioned before, he was leading a force called the Chouans, which, anyway, it means this in French. I've had enough with this French nonsense. And the Chouans basically were guerrillas. The whole classic, cut someone's head off and then hang them from a tree and then make sure everybody sees them, the proper guerrillas. They would try and assassinate people, and they often did it. So these guys were running around as this elite. They're smugglers, so they know all the back roads. They've got stash houses everywhere. They were very famous for having these underground hideouts under trees, disguised with tree roots and that sort of thing. So they could just attack you, literally take 20 steps back, go underground, and you'll never find them. So they were continuing this brutal guerrilla war, and even long after the war ended, they were still just assassinating government troops, even when Napoleon took power. When the government would send tax collectors and all this sort of thing into the Vendee, a lot of the Chouans would pick the musket or the rifle off the shelf, go out, and then there'd be one less government official. Anyway, the rest of the men of the Vendee sort of joined that movement. So the Republican Army moves in and starts burning crops. That's the main thing they really do that kills a lot of people, is destroying crops. Because obviously you need food to live. I know you come here for all the detailed information and the hard to find stuff. That's why you come to this channel. They were especially brutal against the women of the Vendee. As I mentioned at the start of the video, the women were really the major political force behind resistance to the French government in the Vendee. The women were the most pious. The women had their children to be conscripted, and the French Republicans saw the women as these breeding, literally breeders of future royalists and future anti-revolutionaries. So, as far as they were concerned, these were just walking incubators of dissent, and so they were particularly nasty against the women, often just killing them. Which is why so many of them traveled with the armies for protection. The colons infernales, or infernal columns, which is what they were called, came into the Vendee in the first sort of 6 months of 1794 and killed about 50,000 people died as a direct result of being murdered by these infernal columns. Which was the name the Vendeans gave them, not the name the government gave them. At one point, there were 14 of these things running around the Vendee in these big groups that just moved from town to town, burning things, destroying things. Anyway, the Vendee eventually became such a problem, and the troops were needed elsewhere, that the government a peace treaty was sort of done up, which was basically the Vendee was allowed to have its own clergy. The French government rules around religion did not apply in the Vendee. So the priests could come back, they could have the churches back, they could have the church schools back, the bishop could come back. Religion could be in the Vendee, which was, that's a big plus. That was one of the major things. That was the major thing, really. That was a problem for the people of the Vendee. They wanted their religion back. Also, they basically just stopped sending conscription officers into the Vendee, which also, was another one of the big things. They couldn't unkill the king, but you can't always get what you want, as the saying goes. Or actually, the saying, as I was told, it was you can't always get what you want, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't fight for it, which probably applies more to the people of Vendee. So the war ends in the sort of middle of 1794. About 180 to 200,000 people in the Vendee are dead, whether that's by being murdered by the government or in combat, or as in being murdered by the government, dying in combat, dying from disease, or just because the government burned all your food and now you have no food. They had their religion back at the end of the day. They didn't have to fight in these massacring, destructive wars. French generals would give these great speeches about how we rode through the Vendee and just smashed the heads of every child and baby we saw and just killed everyone. It's a nasty, nasty thing. I don't think it's a genocide in the fact that it's doesn't really fit. But I mean, march in and kill a bunch of people and then, try and make an argument that we're not genociding them. It's just mass murder. It's so much different. Anyway, rambling. It's almost an hour long. One of the funny things is that even after Napoleon took power, and even after Napoleon in 1799 signed this even bigger peace deal with the Vendeans, I keep saying signed a peace deal, he basically just gave them more rights and privileges. These Chouans still tried to kill him. These Chouans had such a hatred of the government that some of them even went to Paris and tried to assassinate Napoleon in Paris. Unfortunately, none of them succeeded. But these Chouans did not give up, man. Even in the decade, 2 decades later, they were still really mad at the government. Jean Chouan, Jean Chouan, Jean Cateau, he died. He died in 1793, I want to say, 1794. He died because his sister-in-law had been injured. She'd broken a leg or sprained an ankle or something, and she couldn't run. And as one of these infernal columns was coming through, he tried to get her out of the way. So he went to her house, grabbed her, and basically he could have either abandoned her and live, or stayed with her and be killed. And he stayed and was executed. Was shot in the. He was shot trying to save his sister-in-law's life, which is kind of sad. A lot of the leaders of the Vendee ended up dead. A lot of them died. Catalino's family was actually made nobility by the king when the king took power again. He ennobled, which is what it's called, Catalino's surviving family, although a lot of them ended up dying in the Vendee. About a quarter of the Vendee was killed. About a quarter of the people who lived on the Vendee were no longer alive, once the government sort of backed off. It sucked a lot of resources out of the French military. It really did a number on this idea that the French Revolution was some sort of peasant thing that the nobility were opposed to. And it showed the French government that this area could just kick off at any time. And so for the French were always very wary of this Vendee area. And they always had troops nearby just in case. Which became, an issue because in 1813 and 1814, they did it again with Napoleon. Once again, when Napoleon needs more troops or more taxes, or he tries to, go back on some of his word, which is classic Napoleon, they start kicking off again, but never to the scale they did before. Just riots and murder and that sort of thing. It didn't get hectic. One thing they did do is in the 100 Days campaign, which is Napoleon's big thing that ends at Waterloo, the Vendeans rose up again. The Catholic and Royal Army, the Vendee banners again. They did have a banner, by the way. I'll see if I can find a picture of it. It still exists today, covered in blood and bullet holes, and that's quite interesting. I'll see if I can find a picture. They rose up, and 10,000 troops from Napoleon's army were sent to deal with them. And seeing as he only had about, 80,000 troops at Waterloo, maybe less, maybe more, closer to 75, those 10,000 probably would have come in useful if they weren't forced to put down a rebellion in the Vendee. Not that it would have changed the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo, but it did. It shows that these uprisings aren't just pipe dreams and these, romantic actions of these people. They actually can be a real pain to deal with. 10,000 troops is not a small number when you're talking about a Napoleonic-sized army. Anyway. That was the war in the Vendee. I've wanted to make that video for a while. It took a long time to do a lot of the research for this. So thank you for putting up with it. It's probably going to be about an hour long. I will mention just some other stuff. If you're not interested in anything beyond the Vendee, you can sort of stop watching now. But a lot of people who went and fought for Pope Pius IX in this sort of... he put out a call in the 1860s for men to come and defend the Papal States against the Italian unification. And a lot of the people who came were descendants of people who rose up in the Vendee Rebellion. Charles Colombe's got a book think it's called Papal Zouave. I'll put it up here, which basically documents the sheer amount of Vendean descendants who went and fought for the Pope. I've wanted to talk about this before. I've never mentioned it, but there's a guy called Miles Cogue. Cogue is an Irishman, so he's got this bizarre name. Miles, Captain Miles, who was an Irishman who went with this thing to the Papal Zouaves, who look like this and wore grey. And it's strange because the Zouave uniform is an African thing. It was the uniform of the day for these cool troops. Anyway, that's a tangent in a tangent in a tangent. So Miles goes to fight for the Pope, fights in a bunch of these battles, gets decorated with these medals, and then peace kind of happens. And he isn't really looking for peace. He came to defend the Holy Father, not to be a guard. Not to literally defend him, otherwise he would have joined the Swiss Guard. But anyway, he ends up going to America because America is having, Boogaloo 2 slavery or whatever, civil war. So he goes and joins not the Confederates, the Union. He joins the Union troop as a cavalryman, cavalry officer. And then after the war, he stays on in the American Army as a cavalry officer, and he dies at Little Bighorn. His horse is actually the only survivor of Little Bighorn, which is interesting. And this guy, Miles Cogue, everybody around him had their bodies desecrated, like they had it mutilated or bits cut off or scalped or whatever, except for him. They took all of his valuables, but they didn't touch his body because they saw his medal, which was something like this. I'm not sure exactly which one it was, but it was this kind of thing. A papal medal. And a lot of the Sioux, it turns out, were actually Catholic because Catholic missionaries had been active in that area for a long time, which was strange when I first heard that. But anyway, so they didn't desecrate his body because they're like, well, he's got this Catholic thing, and they saw he had the Agnus Dei around his neck, Lamb of God. So they sort of recognized this and stepped away, which I thought was interesting. So anyway, that's kind of linked to the Vendee, and that a lot of people from the Vendee, their descendants, fought for the Papal Zouaves, which included this one character who I'll put in here. And then the Papal Zouaves would go on to fight for Napoleon III, and then... Anyway, that's its own video, which I'm not going to make anytime soon. Thank you very much for watching. Have a wonderful day.